So now we go on to the exciting topic, writing your research paper, an outline for academic writing. First of all, what is an outline? Hopefully you guys know what an outline is at this point, but let's at least define it, just in case. An outline is an organized list of your supporting ideas. Creating an outline, whether you're doing it formally, that is with the A's and the B's and the 1s and 2s and stuff, whether formal or informal, can help you stay focused on your topic, include all your major points, and present these points in a logical manner. And I'm going to give you a structure, an outline that is sort of a fill in the blank for you to kind of help you not just write your research paper in this class, but hopefully be able to write any potential research papers you may have throughout the program. I'm fairly sure that you will not get this again from other instructors in the future. That is, they may give you a research assignment, but may not give you the structure to use to write it with. So I'm hoping that this is a tool that may be helpful for you, not just in this class, but in other classes following. So how do we create an outline? First of all, you want to identify your primary topic of the paper, which hopefully you've already done that anyway in this paper. Jot down the major points you want to include in the paper. Organize the points in the order you will present or discuss them. Expand each point with additional bullet points that support the point. And here's a really important thing. I think maybe more important than all the others, because I see this all the time, even at the master's level. Don't just insert information into a paper. Okay? You've got all this stuff a lot of times you want to say, and maybe it seems to flow okay, but it isn't really organized by idea. It isn't necessarily organized by reasons to accept the thesis. You've got to think about that. You want to organize each paragraph so that it creates a reason to support your thesis or serve the purpose of that section of the paper. If you're jumping around ideas, it ends up with a lot of redundancy, and sometimes you end up confusing your reader. So you want to make sure that you aren't just sort of sticking sentences and paragraphs in different places, that it's actually flowing in an order that makes sense, that supports the main idea of what your paper is. Another thing that I'll say too, before we actually get to the structure, is I want to mention the idea of title headings to you. At this point, you may not have used title headings in research papers. You may not have written anything long enough to justify the use of title headings. Usually if you're just like, 2, 3, 4 pages or something like that, it's just a short little essay, so it doesn't matter. But if you're writing longer stuff, it is helpful for the reader to see sort of subheadings that separate your work out into pieces, to sort of help them mentally organize what you're doing, and honestly to help you organize what you're doing as well. So I would encourage you anyway to use title headings in this. It's long enough that I think it would justify at least practicing this. It's not a huge paper, but it's probably relatively long compared to what you guys have done before. Each major point in your outline should be converted into a title heading, except the introduction. You don't need a little heading that says introduction. It's the beginning of the paper. We know it's the introduction. Use title headings to break your written work into sections and help you organize your paper. You don't necessarily have to use the titles that I have here, like literature review or evidence or analysis or whatever, right? You can use your own names, but you still probably want to follow this basic structure. It will help you stay organized. So let's start off talking about an introduction and what's in an introduction. An introduction, obviously, purpose is to introduce the issue. Then you want to explain to your reader why they should be interested in your topic. In fact, I would say a lot of times what I find in undergraduate papers that I see all the time is this, you start off with a quote, or you start off with a cute little anecdote or something like that, just something to get their attention, and that's great. If you're in a creative writing class, that's wonderful. But if you're doing business writing or academic writing or stuff that's more serious, you don't want to beat around the bush. You don't want to mess around with stuff. You just basically want to say, this is what it's about, and more than that, this is why it's important. This is why I am selling it to you, okay? Why is your instructor or your audience or your boss or whoever, why are they spending their time reading this, okay? If they don't know or don't understand why they're wasting their time, because everybody's time is precious, reading your stuff by the end of the first paragraph, then they're either going to lose interest or just not read it, right? So part of writing is the same as what you do in business. It's selling, okay? You have to convince somebody that what you have to say is worth saying. And one idea that I have as far as mentioning this is using a puzzle as a way to introduce your topic. Think of something that's unusual, something that's crazy, something that you wouldn't expect necessarily, and that sometimes is a way to try to get people's attention. You would expect the answer to be this, but here's an interesting answer that maybe you haven't thought of, right? If you can convince somebody that what you have to say isn't obvious, it's something interesting, and maybe even something useful, then you might actually get past that first paragraph and somebody thinks that whatever it is you have to say is worthwhile. Okay? So think about that a little bit. How can you sell it? How can you get people to believe that it's worthwhile? You also want to offer your research question. If not in question form itself, at least say basically what it's about. You want to tell people from the beginning what it's going to be. You also want to declare your thesis, okay? Traditionally speaking, in most undergraduate papers, the thesis is located sort of as the last sentence of your introductory paragraph. There's usually just one paragraph, and that's that. Now, you can be a little more expansive if you want to be. If you need an introduction of 2 or 3 paragraphs or whatever, it's a little bit longer, that's fine. It doesn't necessarily have to be the last sentence, but it needs to be very, very obvious that this is your main point, that this is what I'm trying to argue. And one reason why it's often the very last sentence is that everything that you've got sort of builds up to that point. Therefore, this is the argument, right? That's the climax, okay? As I said before, you need to explain why your answer is important or unique, similar to the sort of why they should be interested. And keep in mind, I know I said this last week, but I'm going to say it again, right? Declare your thesis. Thesis has to be in the introduction at some point, somewhere, okay? Like I said, it's not a mystery. It's not going to be like, ooh, wow, just wait till the end and you'll discover what I learned, right? You need to make sure that that's all clear from the beginning. So the next thing on the structure anyway, after an introduction and thesis, is a literature review, okay? Now, you guys may not have heard it called this before. Maybe they didn't even explain this to you. I don't know. This is something that's often done from people who do more advanced academic writing, but it's still a really good way to organize even an undergraduate paper, to think about it like this. And that is, what information, what literature are people going to need to know in order to understand what your topic is, what your argument is all about, okay? It may involve some definitions, although, you don't want to become way too late in that. If you want to define things, you want to try to do so in a way that you can measure, try to understand and prove something to really be the case, right? But you want to ask yourself, what general knowledge does the reader need to understand your topic? What are the competing hypotheses or competing arguments, right? Last week, remember we talked about hypotheses as being sort of different alternatives, potential guesses to whatever you're trying to explain in your thesis statement. Well, the competing arguments would be those that disagree with your thesis. So to go back to the example of social loafing, for example, right? If you say what causes social loafing, and your answer is it's diligent isolates, right? Then you want to hit the other ones that people say are the other answers, right? Some people say it's this, some people say it's this. This is why I think we're going to go with this. Okay, so you want to, from the very beginning, acknowledge that there are different points of view, okay? And you want to give them the best possible spin, too. It's not just, you're not just looking to tear down those other arguments. You're not trying to create straw men in your arguments, just something you can knock down really easily. It's not a political argument, it's not a debate, you're trying to seek the truth. And so you want to look at things on the face value. And honestly, if your argument is the most persuasive one, then it should be able to take the other arguments on their strongest grounds. So you need to articulate those strongest grounds, or else people are just not going to take your argument very credibly. Okay? To what theoretical concepts does your topic relate? Theory is something that you'll experience quite a bit as your courses go on. A lot of people are like, oh, theory, whatever, right? Theory is something that explains not just like what happens in a particular situation, but what happens across the board in general. Like if I were to say, hey, what caused 9/11? You could come up with a whole bunch of different causes and blah, 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 right? Well, that would be really good. It'd be really interesting because you'd be explaining one event. Well, a more interesting question, say to people in the Pentagon or in politics or whatever, wouldn't just be like what caused 9/11, but what causes people to do crazy things like that a lot. Okay, not just in one case, but in many cases, right? That's theory. Okay, so as you are reading through various textbooks, different courses in the future, whatever that may be, you're going to run across these theories. And these theories are attempts to try to explain something not just in one special case, but in a whole lot of cases over a long period of time, which for you as potential business practitioners is extremely important, extremely helpful. You know, I may be able to sort of strategize about a particular case based on the way a few people are behaving, but if I can come up with some principles that seem to be true for most people most of the time and be able to apply those principles in a general way, that's awesome, right? And so part of the practice of a literature review is to say, what in general do we know about this? You know, what have people been able to discover about this? What theories are there that support or challenge whatever approach, whatever thesis statement I've come up with? Okay, you follow me so far? If you're actually to try to organize a literature review sort of in an outline fashion, you know, you're asking in this section, what are different answers to your research question? First of all, include any information you think is necessary to understand this. I would argue that you ought to be succinct. I have had people before in some of my international business classes, they're doing some paper on China and they're expounding upon the Ming Dynasty or something like that, right? And it's ridiculous, okay? So be succinct, be on point, you know, you don't need to explain absolutely everything, but try to be pretty focused about it. And then, like I said, you provide different answers to that research question. You know, like say, what causes social loafing? What's the first answer? And what's good about that answer? What's bad or right or wrong about that answer, right? What's the next hypothesis or the next potential answer? What's right or wrong with that, right? What's yours? How does that fit in with those questions? Why is your approach or your way of going about this a better way of going about this? Okay, so these are the kinds of things that you want to think about anyway as you're putting together your literature review in terms of its organization. Follow? Okay. All right, evidence. This section should be a really large part of your paper. This is where you're actually trying to gather the data, get the stuff, you know, the stories, the case studies, the information, all of the stuff that is going to support whatever argument it is that you're trying to make. You're trying to present this evidence, you want to support your thesis statement. So you want to try to prove why your argument is valid or why it works in the real world. You know, in your literature review, it's a little bit more in la-la land, right? You're just like saying, okay, these scholars say this, and these theories say this, and that's fine and everything, right? And here's the information. But in this part, you're saying, we know it's true, and here's why, because it happened in real life here. Or these statistics say so right here, okay? It's this as much in black and white as we can come up with, and that's the evidence. That's the stuff that you're coming up with here, okay? So what kind of evidence supports your thesis? The kinds of things that I might encourage you to look for are statistics and case studies. Where can you get statistics? You know, there's great sources of data that are often hosted by government agencies and academic units and universities. You can get it sometimes through articles in raw form. We talked about peer-reviewed journals. You can look through some of those. Sometimes they have raw data as well. Where do you get case studies? One, like I said, is peer-reviewed journal articles is one place to look for it. Another one is just so many other sources. Quite honestly, you can look in your textbook, you can look in history books, peer-reviewed journal articles, news sources. You can go to that search engine that I showed you, that Academic Source Premier, and there's a little drop-down menu that says narrow to case studies, right? So if you just want to find case studies, that's cool. It will narrow that down for you. So that's kind of nice too. So it's a nice feature of Baker. But you know, by case studies, we're basically talking about, you know, stories that illustrate what is valid. Okay, so, you know, let's say that you're, again, I guess I've been using this social loafing thing, right? And you're wanting to prove diligent isolates cause it. And, you know, maybe you are looking at cases of when this has happened in real businesses. So, you know, I don't know, maybe you find cases of small working groups at HP, or small working groups at Google, or small working groups at someplace where they've studied this kind of thing, and they say, okay, you know, let's look at the data and sort of see whether or not that is supporting the argument that I have regarding diligent isolates. You see what I'm saying? Like, you're looking at real evidence, you're looking at real stories, real people, and scholars who have sort of gathered this data in a fairly objective fashion. When you're dealing with interviews, you've got to realize that they're anecdotal. That is, you're asking one person their opinion, their story, their version of what happened, okay? And if you attribute too much weight to that, then that becomes a very biased answer, right? You just basically are having one person's opinion. So for the most part, you know, you want stuff that's a little bit more systematic than that, right? You want just not the opinion of one person, but the aggregated results from lots of people speaking. And having said that, it's still nice sometimes to illustrate by asking, by doing interviews or something. The other thing is that I'll say, and we'll go over this in a few minutes, is that let's say that you're doing a research project yourself, and you think it might be good to include that kind of thing. Like maybe you're the one doing the interview or something. I don't think there's an instructor around who's basically going to say, "Oh no, don't do that. That'd be a bad idea." I mean, that's great. Of course, it's anecdotal, right? But what you want to do then is, in an upcoming part that we'll talk about here, is you want to put out some caveats, some qualifiers, and basically say, "Look, this is one person's opinion. It's not affecting the entire picture of what I'm telling you, but it is illustrating some things, right? Nobody at an undergraduate level is expecting you to sort of have an absolute slam dunk in terms of proving a thesis statement, right? You're going to do the best you can with the materials you've got. But the important thing is, and this is a good step toward analyzing not just research papers or business writing or doing anything in your work, is to understand the limitations of the data that you have, right? If you go out to a boss or whatever and you've got some information and you want them to make a key decision based on that information, you want to make sure that they understand what those limitations are. And if they don't, they might make a bad decision, right? Well, the same thing is true when you talk about research papers or anything else that you write. If one person that I interview says, you ought to manage these people using this method, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Maybe it's a good experienced person and maybe it's good advice, right? But do I want to base my whole decision-making process based on what one person says? Maybe not. So it's useful, it's helpful, but you have to make sure that you couch that properly when you include it. Okay? Cool. Make sense? Okay. As far as structuring an evidence section, you're just sort of doing it usually case by case. It's not very integrated. So like, now I'm going to present, now I'm talking about this case, right? Now I'm talking about this case. Now I'm talking about another case. Or here's a set of statistics, here's a set of statistics. It's organized sort of bits and pieces as independent reasons to support the thesis. Okay, and it's usually separated out like that. The next section is an analysis section. Okay, at this point, so far, all you've done in the evidence really is you just, offered some numbers or told me a story, told me what the information is, right? In this part, you're telling me why this information supports the thesis that you've got. Okay, so you've got this now a new section where you're saying, okay, well, here's what everybody else said, here's all the different positions, and this is why I think that this is the correct position, and here's the evidence to support it. Now I'm going to take this evidence and connect it back to the thesis and explain how it supports that. So you're explaining how and why the evidence you found specifically supports the thesis. How do you know it's the right kind of evidence? How do you know that it's enough evidence? Can you establish some criteria to evaluate the evidence and prove that you've met that criteria? Now these are pretty tall orders. You can't just take for granted that the stuff that you gather necessarily really proves the thing that you say it's going to prove. Okay? Maybe up to this point you haven't thought about that so much. If you happen to have written a research paper before and you're like, okay, well, here's a statement, so I got a whole bunch of quotes from some people, and here's a few percentage things from the New York Times or whatever, and okay, I win, yay! If you're really wanting to be analytical about this and not just play academics, if you want to be able to go into your boss someday and sort of say, look, I really can look at this report and tell you whether or not it's good or whether or not it doesn't have any grounds to it. You have to think a little bit more methodically about that. And that is, how do you know that the stuff that you've got is actually going to support that? And so you've got to ask yourself some questions like, can I build some criteria to sort of say, if I have all of this stuff, then that's enough to prove this thing. Or maybe all of this stuff is not enough to prove this thing, right? But at least you're sort of creating a foundation. You're setting a benchmark. You're setting it up in such a way that maybe you can try to achieve this. So let me give you an example. Again, going back to the social loafing example. Let's say that you're looking at certain case studies, right? And in this, and if you're trying to establish criteria, like if I see examples of people who are not doing all of the work they're supposed to do, right? That can be defined as social loafing. Okay, that's how I'm going to define social loafing. It's defined that way in the literature. If I see that happening, in this case, then I'll know that that's a legitimate case of that happening. If I see this kind of behavior over here, like these people who are doing all of the work, I'm going to call those people diligent isolates. So I know that that's happening too, right? And so then if I see these, if I see certain statements from these people, like from the social loafers. You know, I don't feel like I can compete with these people over here who's doing too much, you know. I mean, you set up these sort of things, like if I hear these kinds of things, then it would lend credence to the fact that this is what's really happening in this case, okay? Let's say that you're doing, let's just pick another example, maybe, you know, I don't know, somebody give me your thesis, like what are you trying to explain?
Ethics in the workplace can only be regulated by policy and procedure.
Okay, all right, so you're trying to explain ethics in the workplace, and policy and procedures trying to be the independent ethics. Okay, so so your competing theories would be, it's not just policies and procedures, right? It could also just sort of be like, you know, it's the ethics in my heart and I'm all self-regulated, as opposed to policies and procedures or something, right? I mean, that's, anyway, another approach. That would be a competing argument to that. Well, what you want to do is, let's say that, you know, you're looking at, let's say you're doing case studies, right? And maybe you've got some case studies that say, that illustrate a company that has just sort of a, you know, do-it-yourself sort of approach to ethics. You trust the person to sort of make that decision. And then you look at maybe a couple of other case studies where they have policies and procedures in place, okay? And then maybe you're talking about cases where ethics were violated, right? So here's a couple of cases of ethics violations in this scenario, and a couple of situations of ethics violations in this scenario, right? And then you say, okay, well, in this case, if ethics were violated in these two cases over here, and there were no policies and procedures, what does that tell us?
There wasn't an innate ethical motivator?
Yeah, people are just like ruled by human nature, and they need policies and procedures to be controlled, right? And then in this case over here, let's say you've got the policy and procedure companies, and there's a couple of ethics crises, but people make the right choices because, I don't know, maybe there's enforcement means or something like that, right? And that lends support anyway for policies and procedures. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So you want to actually say that the way that I'm going to look at these cases is that if I see examples of, you know, failures in the non-policy and procedure and successes in the policy and procedure areas, then I will know that this will lend support to my thesis. So you see what I'm saying? You're being very explicit about not just assuming that the stories tell the story that you want to, but actually showing exactly how that story proves the thing that you say you want to prove, okay, as explicitly as you can. So anyway, so this analysis section, right, you're organizing this section based on the reasons why the reader should believe your argument. You're using examples from the cases and data to support the reasons why your argument is valid, right? In this particular case, there was a violation, and it was individual ethics, and this is how it happened, and you include some details, and so this clearly is how it links back, right? So this is one reason. And you may have several reasons, and so your analysis section is a series of that. How does your evidence outweigh the most valid arguments on the opposing side, right? Link back to your lit review section where you're looking at the other arguments, the other potential answers. It's like, why do I win? You know, why is this valid? Not that it's really about winning and losing, right? But you know, you just like, why is this valid? Why is this true? Versus what some of the other alternatives are. If not, where does that leave your argument? Is there still something that you can learn from your thesis or your approach if you don't just sort of really slam dunk this? You know, I will also say that, you want to say what can you prove with your evidence and what can't you prove. And it's okay to say, I don't know, or more precisely, they don't know. There isn't enough evidence is a valid argument. Like there was in one of the last orientation classes I taught, somebody was writing about leadership, and their original argument was that leadership was not, is not something that you inherited, but something that could be learned. And she did a lot of research and basically said, look, I can't make heads or tails of this because, you know, it's basically, there's so much evidence on both sides and nobody can seem to agree on either. And so her argument basically became that, you know, both sides are wrong. And that's okay. So if you're organizing an analysis section, right, you want to think about, okay, the first reason your thesis is valid, and you use supporting data and evidence for it, you know, including whatever criteria you might have considered. Right? Here's the second reason. You explain, and here's the thing too, you want to explain the limitations of your evidence and analysis. This goes back to a point, you were asking before about interviews and stuff. If there's anything that's in your method, in the way that you're approaching this, that makes you think, you know what, I mean, I can't really prove this 100%, you should basically say that. And you should include all the reasons why maybe it's not absolute. I mean, look, even the top researchers in the country have a qualifier section, usually toward the end of anything that they write, where they basically say, okay, yeah, we did all this stuff and it was so awesome and here's why we're so right. But here are all the things that we couldn't cover, here are all of the reasons why it might not be 100%, here are all the reasons why it could be wrong, you know, and if the top best people who do this stuff all the time can do that kind of thing, then you can too. Look, I hate to say you're just undergraduates, but you are, you are learning this, okay? If you look at 4 cases, just to use your ethics example, 2 cases from, or 4 cases from 4 different companies, all along the line divided like that, do you think that 4 cases is going to be enough really to sort of slam dunk your ethics case? Yeah, I don't think so, right? That doesn't mean that you're wrong, but what you can do is say, well, I cannot prove definitively that this is the case, but I can tell you that based on these cases, this is the direction it's going, right? And for an undergraduate paper, that's enough. That's okay. Why might your argument still be valid, even if there are limitations to your evidence and analysis? And then finally, we come down to a conclusion. What did we learn from your paper? You want to explain how your argument is valid and or sound. How does the analysis support your central argument? And this is really a big deal more than anything, I think, is why was it important? You really want to be selling this thing throughout the paper, but certainly at the introduction and the conclusion. When somebody's done reading your paper, they need to remember why it was important. Why was it worth my while to actually sit through this paper and read it? What did I learn? What's going to keep me up at night, sort of wondering, wow, that was so cool. What did they do? That was great. Strong finish. And part of a strong finish, it isn't just being refined or have a nice style or whatever, right? It's about explaining why somebody should really care about it. Why does it matter? So, the next section is works cited and notes. Your case, your bibliography should contain no fewer than 3 scholarly sources. We did talk about quality of sources last week already, so don't want to have that discussion again, but if you do have questions about that, we can certainly talk more about it. If you want any sources besides those, you certainly can go beyond that. You can have as many sources as you like. All source material should follow the proper MLA formatting and be properly integrated into the paper. What that means is that everything that's in the work cited is also cited somewhere in your paper, okay? So as you know probably from MLA format, if you've already looked at your writer's reference, MLA format involves parenthetical notation to indicate the source, okay? It's the name of the author and the page number, basically, within those parentheses. And the page number is very important, by the way. You don't want to blow that stuff off. If you're looking at a website that don't have a page number, fair enough. But most stuff, even on the web, if it's a real published thing, usually has page numbers too, so you want to include it. But what I'm saying is that, you don't want stuff in your works cited that doesn't have a parenthetical notation, that's not attached to something that you're actually using to prove it, okay? Everything should be connected. If you guys have any questions about anything regarding how to write this research paper,